So with that, I'm going to unspotlight me and ask you if first you have any reactions or thoughts on what I presented. And secondly, I'm curious for what you think are the most important changes you've seen in LGBTQ issues in the last 25 or 30 years. So any thoughts, reactions, comments, please?
Yes. I work for a market research company, and I remember it was either you were male, and this I worked through the 90s, so you were either male or female. And if you didn't qualify, if you weren't either one or the other, if somebody said, we would just say, oh, well, thank you very much, that quota has been filled, because we wouldn't know where to put them, whether they're male or female. Now when I see surveys, I do some online, they have male, female, I mean, every possible thing, and another. I mean, rarely do you see one that just says male or female. So I noticed that has really changed over the years.
Yeah. One thing go ahead, please.
Oh, I was just going to say another thing is when you say about accepting and all that, there's still a lot of people that don't accept. 48 Hours recently had something of the program, it's true story, about this young boy. He was a college student. His name was Blaze, Jewish and gay, and he was killed. The trial hasn't even happened. So you know the story is relatively new. He lived in California. He was killed by a member of one of these Nazi groups, and they're still out there, and they will not accept gays, and they won't accept Jews, and he just happened to fit into both categories. It was really a sad story, and so, I mean, not everybody's accepting.
No, that's absolutely true. Absolutely true. I was going to say on the gender question, we did a survey for our congregation some years ago, and we were debating how do we approach this gender question on the survey. And then somebody asked us, do you really care what gender the person is filling out the survey? Are you going to break out the numbers by what women members of Kol Hadash think about the newsletter versus what men or non-binary people at Kol Hadash think about the newsletter? It doesn't really matter. So if it doesn't matter, you're not going to get anything meaningful out of it, then why even bother asking? Sometimes the most inclusive way is to just, it doesn't matter unless you want it for demographic purposes or to show that there are, in fact, people who don't fit into that neat binary as a positive stat. But if you're not going to use it, then you don't necessarily have to ask. Other thoughts on progress in the last couple decades?
I have comments.
Please.
You officiated at my wedding and Bill Parker's wedding, and it was interesting because
we did twice.
Yes, twice. One at the Botanic Garden, and that was the real wedding, and then there was the show wedding at the club, at the Medina Country Club, which the interesting thing is I had said to our friends with whom we're having dinner tomorrow night here in Tucson, I said, Don, are you sure it's going to be okay to have a gay wedding? And he says, oh, I'll ask the catering manager. I said, no, I want you to ask the general manager. And he asked the general manager, and the general manager said, Don, this is 2000, whatever it was, 6 years ago or something. Of course it's fine. And after that, Adam, interestingly enough, the catering manager called me and she said, would you give me the name of the rabbi? We need a rabbi who will marry disparate groups, not just sexually, but religion, etc.
Right.
My children, I have 3 daughters. Julie, Deutsch, and I were married for 27 years. And I've discussed this with each of the kids, and it's interesting comments. Their comments were they were more traumatized by the divorce than by me coming out as gay. And I said, seriously? And they said, yes. That's all we thought about was that our family is dissolved and you're the cause of it, and that's terrible. But the fact that you're gay, that's okay. And it was kind of interesting that that should happen. Bill and I will be celebrating 32 years on July 28th. And no, on July, I can't remember. His birthday is either the 20th or the 28th, and our anniversary is either the 20th or the 28th. I write it down on a cheat sheet that I have here that's somewhere. And Julie used to say to me, Larry, you and I dated for 3 years before, so our 27 years of marriage was really 30 of being together. And at 30 2, I said, Julie, I think we finally have come to the, she said, okay, I give in. You have the longer relationship now with Bill. It's interesting that Bill has a transgender grandchild, and he is traumatized by it. I'm not. The parents are not. Bill is. And I said, Bill, what's the big deal? And he said, well, he was William Forrest Parker III, which is named for me. Now he's Gemma Parker, and that doesn't count. I said, you've got to be a little bit more liberal. You come from an identity that really, you're lucky to be where you are in this day and age, but don't hold it against your transgender granddaughter, who was a grandson. And he said he was such a cute little boy. I said, he's a cute little girl. It's just the way it is. So the world is moving on. I noticed that David Hirsch has he, him, and Rabbi Chalom has he, his. So if you think it's confusing for some people, just on the screen, it's confusing to me as to whether it should be he, him, or he, his. There's no right or no wrong, and I'm glad that Judaism, at least humanistic Judaism, is getting to the point where it's learning each year to be more and more open, because I, having just celebrated my 80th birthday, which Julie Deutsch's was June 2nd, mine was April 12th, am now considered an elderly person. But I look at myself and I say, I don't look that much older than all of you, except David Hirsch, who is, I know, much younger. Right, David? Big smile, yes. So in any case, it was just my stream of consciousness thoughts.
Sure.
Any more comments?
Well, and I'll add also, Larry, I had a chance to stick around for the reception at the country club after the bigger wedding. And both of your ceremonies were really meaningful to me to be a part of. But I was really struck by one of the toasts. I forget which of your grandkids said it, but they said how meaningful it was to their generation to be able to see a celebration of love like this that was so challenging for previous generations to do, and it's inspiring for people of their age to see the kind of example that you set of a loving partnership over at this point most of a lifetime.
It was Gertie, my granddaughter, my oldest granddaughter, who just turned 25, and at the time she was crying, and I said, Gertie, why are you crying? And I said, this is a happy occasion. She said, because I'm thinking of my friend, and he had a name, but I don't remember his name now, who she was going to be able to talk to at New Trier on Monday, explaining that now he could get married. In fact, he could have kids, he could do all these things. And she was crying because of the revisionist theories that have come about. And it was very, very sweet. My grandchildren and even my children really think so differently about gay life than we, who were the generation before, or our parents who were really far back, had to deal with. And it's kind of an interesting observation that as times move on, it becomes more and more acceptable and easier. And Hebrew, I didn't realize you had all those. I took Hebrew, I was bar mitzvah, but now I'm B mitzvah, apparently. I have to remember that.
It's not retroactive.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Leora, please go ahead.
Well, this is kind of for Larry. So when I grew up, there was a gay couple in the house. We lived in the hills. There was a gay couple in the house below us and a gay couple in the house above us.
This is Los Angeles, for those who don't know the hills.
This is the Hollywood Hills, and a gay couple across the street. And it turned out that my neighborhood had been built as an enclave for gays. There was one road in and one road out. It formed like a P, and they had built this as a safe community. So I grew up with the concept of acceptance of gays. And then I went to Gertie's bat mitzvah, and I was seated at a table with Larry and Bill and Julie and some other people. And I didn't know Larry and Bill other than handing them their name tags. And Julie didn't really know her other than handing her the name tag. And I sat there and was kind of amazed and confused because I didn't know who matched with who, because it was so open and so friendly and so loving between everybody at that table. And it took me a while to figure out what was going on. So it was, I want to say, Larry, that it was a wonderful afternoon to spend with you and Bill and Julie. And I forget what year it was, but having grown up with couples who were not out, who were very private, who kept their relationships quiet, it was, and I don't think I knew any gays in college or afterwards. So to meet you and Bill and Julie and watch that loving relationship was so wonderful. So I want to thank you for that.
Thank you, Leora. And we still go to services, Julie and I, together. Bill doesn't come because, as he said, when I first asked him, do you really believe in all that Christian stuff, that Christ rose and all this kind of stuff? He said, I believe less even than you do. He said, so if you want to go to services, you go, because I'm not religious enough to want to go to services on the high holidays. He does, however, cook a most fabulous brisket. He does all of the right things, so he fits in beautifully. And the kids said, Bill, as long as you make a brisket, we don't care if you come to services. That was the approach. It's been it's a blended family, and it's the way it is. And it's good to hear from you, Leora, because I you never know these little stories that only come out occasionally over the years at opportune times. So I'm especially pleased to hear it. Thank you.
So let's think about Jewish life. Are there changes that you've seen? Yeah, David, go ahead.
I just wanted to point out, when I started teaching the confirmation class, I utilized a very heavy-duty comparative Judaism curriculum, not the way we're doing it now. And I insisted, we took the kids to Friday night or Saturday or services at as many denominations of Judaism as we could. One of our first field trips was to what is now a very liberal congregation, one of the largest Reformed congregations then and now, on the North Shore, that at the time had a very openly gay rabbi. At the service we saw, the rabbi's partner was there. They'd adopted a biracial child who was there for part of the time until it started crying, and they took him out. The moment that was the most interesting was as we do in all our field trips to this day, after the service, we sat down with the rabbi and we asked our questions. And one of the students said to the rabbi, would you officiate at a same-sex marriage? His answer was, as long as they're both Jewish. This rabbi had no problems with gay marriage, but if one of the partners was not Jewish, forget about it. And the kids were baffled.
Yeah, it's that balancing of what parts am I changing and what parts am I going to stand firm on. And, there were, in Detroit as well, we had a congregation led by a gay rabbi who would not do intermarriages for a long time because it was that question of kiddushin and sanctification and did it count? But he himself was gay and was happy to affirm gay partnerships. I actually found that when I was in Michigan, I did very few same-sex ceremonies because between that rabbi, our rabbi, Sherwin Wine, who was gay, and plenty of women rabbis who were happy to do those weddings, I, as a straight man, cisgendered, I was low down on the list for people feeling comfortable. And I will say I've done maybe a dozen same-sex wedding ceremonies in my career compared to over 320 opposite gender partnerships. That's just the world that we're in. I do advertise on some pride-based website, for example. There's one called Pridezilla's, which is a pun on Bridezilla. And I've got a nice profile there. I've got a couple of couples that I've married who have some testimonials there. And, again, it's one every couple of years, every few years. Whether people don't feel they need to get married, or they just have friends do their weddings for them, or they don't trust religious authorities It hasn't been as big a part of my work as I would have liked, but I'm happy to celebrate when people come to me and ask for it.
Rabbi, I was fascinated a couple of years ago when Keshet did our LGBTQ audit, and the fact that an organization like Keshet exists shows the changing face of Judaism.
Right. So Keshet is an organization designed for LGBTQ inclusion in Jewish life, and they ran a training session that we participated in. We had an all-day event that I went along with Alana Schaefer, our education director, and Leah Sosowitz, our B Mitzvah coordinator. And so we did some learning about vocabulary, about gender and identity and orientation and so on. And then we did a year-long project working directly with coaches to look at our website, to look at the kind of language we were using and how inclusive we were, what kind of program we could offer. Their in-person person embedded in Chicago, a wonderful non-binary person named Esty, came in and did a program for adult education for us on a Sunday morning. And it really was a valuable learning process for us in discovering those unknown unknowns. The things that we always presented ourselves as inclusive, and the low-hanging fruit we had gotten. For example, when you fill out a membership form, it shouldn't say husband and wife on the blanks, right? It should say, name number 1 and name number 2, if there is a number 2. So we had done those kind of things, but things like renaming the Bar Bat Mitzvah program to the B Mitzvah program, changing the wording of some of the readings in our services to not refer to simple binary divisions. These were things that we had to go back and reevaluate. Even in our creative and inclusive liturgy, there's always going to be something further on that we have to change. And one last thought on that, and then I see Victoria's hands up. This last week, I listened to Ray Bradbury's wonderful short stories called The Martian Chronicles, which was published in 1950, imagining this future, which for him was 2001. But when they reprinted it in the 90s, they set it in the 2030s, so it'd still be in the future for a while. And in some ways, what he wrote was amazingly insightful and prescient in terms of awareness of indigenous peoples' issues and what it feels like to be colonized. He has a wonderful short story that grapples with the question of racism in the South. And again, he's writing this in the late 40s, 1950s. On the other hand, his gender stuff is terrible. His treatment of women is terrible. So as one example, this guy finds he might be the only man left on Mars. And so he starts calling around to see if there's anybody else out there. And he thinks, where would I find a woman? I know, I'll call the beauty parlor. And that's where he finds her. So, it's painful on some level, it's progressive in other levels, and that's the nature of progress. So Victoria, please go ahead.
Even beauty parlor tells you the era that it came from, right? The parlor. So I just wanted to say that, so 2 years ago, which is the last time we had our Pride Shabbat service in person, and our guest speaker, probably many of you were there, was Gira Goldstein from the Gender Cool Project. And it's not specifically, I thought she did a great job of talking about it's not specifically a Jewish group. It's about highlighting transgender kids and telling their stories and sort of normalizing, and it provides a lot of resources for people who know them and care about them. But it was founded by 2 Jewish women, one a mom of a transgender kid, and the other Gira, who came to speak to us, who, by the way, when I introduced myself, said that I went to school with her, but as her previous presentation. And then I remembered who she was. But anyway, one of the things she said that I thought was really helpful for people who could be struggling with a family member who is announcing that they're trans and they don't get it. And she said, what I'm asking is for you to use the name. I introduced myself to you, Gira Goldstein. That's my name. So please use the name that I said. And I'm a woman. So please, refer to me, she, her, and just treat me with the same respect as any other person. that's it. She said, you actually, if you're struggling to understand what transgender means and what are all of the implications, she said, you know, you don't actually, I'm not asking people to be an expert on gender studies or an expert on what this is all about, the science, the psychology. You don't have to, you don't have to feel this pressure. I don't understand. She said, all you have to do is it's obviously is more complicated, as Rabbi Adam was saying about the way we speak, but for the beginning, you don't have to be an expert. You just have to call the person what they asked, as you would when you meet any new person. And it's not really our business, you know, and she gets a lot of really intrusive questions about what kind of surgery she may or may not have had. And the thing is, you don't actually need to know. If you really think about it, curiosity and nosiness is normal. I think it in my head. Of course, I'm curious about people, but you don't have to know. If you're not their doctor, I mean, there's very few people who need to know what's underneath your clothing. It's a tiny group, and it's not someone you met in a social situation. And so just let it go. It doesn't matter. Don't worry about it. And I just thought her points were very common sense, but it was very helpful to hear her articulate them. And it just, and so again, it's not really specifically Jewish, but this is a group founded by these two Jewish women. And I just thought it was really helpful, and I really got a lot out of it.
Yeah, yeah. And you know, Gero was very explicit about her ongoing connection to her Jewish community and her Jewish identity. It didn't feel like she had to pick one or the other to be authentic to herself or to stay connected to her Jewishness. And I mean, that's one of the assets. And again, in the liberal Jewish world, we tend to be very progressive on these questions of gender identity and sexual orientation. So that's to our positive, to enable people to maintain those connections, even as they're going through personal transformations. Yes, go ahead, Judy.
Actually, I have a question for David, because he's a teacher and he sees the kids. Now, I know when I went to high school, and this was in the 60s, nobody was gay. I mean, you just didn't talk about it.
They were.
They were, but we always said that. How come we had nobody who was gay? And I know they were. And then when my kids in the 90s would say, oh, I think this one is, but they really didn't talk about it. I want to ask David, because he taught up until when, last year, a couple of years? Are the kids coming out now, or are they still uncomfortable with the fact that or do you have suspicions? I mean, how are kids dealing with this now?
There's a wide range. There's always been a wide range. And years ago, I want to say 10, 12 years ago, it was unusual to have an out student. I vividly recall going back to my office and hearing a young man who I knew, he wasn't in my class, but I knew him, and he was presenting as gay. And I worried about it. I worried about how he might be treated. A few years later, we had a very high profile student come out as gay, and that opened the doors. And subsequent to that, the shock value, the danger has diminished. It's not gone, but it has become less unusual. Trans is another matter. I've had 2 trans students in class, and there are multiple trans students throughout the building even now, and that's still something that we wrestle with: adult acceptance, with student acceptance. The first trans student I had on the very first day, they said to me, what problem do you have with the singular they? And I remember looking at them and saying, I'm an English teacher. I have been taught they has to be plural. And if you go singular, it's he, she. I said, I'm changing. Old dog can learn new tricks, but you're going to have to give me a moment or two to undo all this grammar training now that it's okay not to. And as the rabbi said, one slips. And occasionally I would say he or they. But the kids the kids are better at it, and the kids get it faster. At least they do now. And
it's in middle schools as well, both transgender identifying kids and gay straight alliances, that kind of thing. It's in middle schools too, it's not just in high schools. And
Adam, it's in elementary schools.
Yeah, for sure.
We have a staff member at Deerfield whose daughter identifies as trans, and she started to identify that way, I believe, in the first grade.
Mm-hmm. And the reality is, again, the kids get it. They use new names, they use new pronouns relatively fluidly. But after all, we use new names too. Someone gets married and they change their name, and you get used to it. You weren't Judy Rosenzweig your whole life. And you changed your name and people got used to it, and they used the new name that you decided to use. And that you got a new title. It was Mrs. So, we change even in historic culture. We're just now applying it to a more elective kind of change at a certain point in time, and more importantly, a more self-directed change that is reflecting who people really are. And I think the last point is, David, you mentioned about safety. One of the things that I think the kids understand sometimes better than older generations is that there's a safety cost to not being yourself, to staying in the closet, to hiding who you are, in mental health, sometimes in suicides. And this is the craziness of these laws that are trying to ban transgender therapy or other kind of affirming experiences for kids, because it's more dangerous for them to not do these things in what they might do to themselves and how they might experience the world, as opposed to affirming who they already feel that they are. And this is something that Gira talked about as well 2 years ago. This is who I've always been. This is not like I've changed. This is who I've always felt like I was, and now I'm finally able to live that truth. Yeah, Cindy, please.
Well, I'm at the age where most of my friends who have kids have children who are now in middle and high school. And I find it incredible how many of them are some variation of not cisgender, some variation of not straight. And what I think is part of the difference is that kind of gradual generational change in attitude. My parents had a conversation when we were in high school, and they grew up very conservative, very much, it's sinful and you'll go to hell and whatever. And then at one point my mom said, well, Frank, what happens if one of the kids are gay? What are you going to do with that? And my dad said, well, I guess we'll just have to love them. And, at that point, he still thought it was not right. But, by the time gay marriage was legalized, my dad had come around 180 degrees on it, and it was fine. It was, welcome. It was whatever. And, so then my generation, I think there are still a lot of people who don't entirely know what to do with it, but are less thrown off by their kids having these other identities. And just a week or two ago, a friend of mine said that his 15-year-old is non-binary, and they're having to have one identity for them with their extended family and another in their nuclear family and in school, and that because actually Indiana is one of the few states that recognizes non-binary as a legal gender. So until they get them legally changed, they're keeping up this kind of dual identity, but it's so hard for them to do that. And I'm just grateful that it's progress is never as fast as we want it to be when it's something that we care about, but it's getting there. It's no longer what it was when I was a kid. So that's
yeah. Leora, please.
Kind of continuing on what Cindy said, one of the things that amazes me, well, because of the pandemic, all of the programs that the Indiana Historical Society, which is where my daughter works, are all on Zoom. And one of the things that has struck me throughout this is that every single person that works for IHS, when their name appears in the corner, like you, Adam, they have he, she, they, them, and it is all out there accepted by what I would think, maybe not, because Cindy says it's the only state that accepts non-binary, but what I would think would be a very conservative state, at least politically. And here they are, a nonprofit public institution, and how they identify is right there on the screen. And I'm with David. I still have problems with they are or them are. It kind of is like fingers on a blackboard, but I'm getting used to it. But I also want to make a comment to you, Adam. Some of us have maintained our original identities and refused to give it up, so we never gave up our maiden names. So there you go.
To thine own self be true.
And Mrs. McCune was my mother-in-law.
Right.
Now, my question, I just have a question. You know, girls can take courses in school, they take physics, they take, you know, all these courses, and the boys can take cooking, or no one would think anything of it. But when it comes to sports, if you have a transgender child, which sports team, I haven't been following this, do they play on? Let's say if somebody was born male, but decides, you know, and then it becomes female, does he play on the girls' sports teams? He'll probably have, I don't know, is he taking a position away?
A trans girl is a girl, a trans boy is a boy. Period.
So you mean whatever they trans to?
No, they always were. You just didn't know. But a trans student participates in the sport with the gender that they identify.
Now, do you find,
at least ideally,
now do you find that the boys who are born male and are playing on the girls' teams, that their ability to throw the ball farther or they can run faster, is that presenting a problem?
You know, Judy, part of the challenge is, first of all, in many cases, they're on hormone replacement therapy, which has all kinds of differing body effects. Mm-hmm. Secondly, there's all kinds of chromosomal, what are called abnormalities, but are part of the spectrum of human life that produce different you know, levels of hormones, testosterone, estrogen, and so on. And gender is a social construct. So we're really not as essentialist about this in terms of, you know, 2X, 2Y chromosomes when it comes to participating in events. And people are always focused on that going one way, but there are plenty of male transgender to male athletes who are competing against boys. And why shouldn't you force them to compete against girls, even though they're getting testosterone? I mean, you know, it would go the other way too. And if the goal, the last point is, and then I see Sandra and William have their hand up. The last point is 99.9% of these athletes in middle and high school are not going to become professionals. They are doing this for self-esteem, for athletic development. Some of them are looking for scholarships to colleges, and that's where it becomes sometimes a challenge. But the reality is that this is an activity. This is an extracurricular. And so if you want to affirm their mental health, you affirm who they are in everything that they do, not just when they go to the bathroom, but even if they're participating in one of these extracurricular activities.
Because I saw that on GMA, where it was somebody in the government in a southern state was very concerned that maybe one of these boys who wanted to play, you know, would be playing on the girls' team, would be taking a scholarship away from his daughter. Because
they're so concerned about women's rights in these places. Sorry, Sandra, and then Julia.
Okay. Yeah, then, I mean, California has rules for high school trans athletes participating, and NCAA does, and the Olympics do. And, you just don't see the domination that the Republicans or conservatives claim will happen. It's like I said, it's an extracurricular activity. They just want to socialize.
Then I wanted to say something also, not just on this, but does this new generation fare once it moves into the workforce for those of us who've come up before? And because there's still not a level of acceptance everywhere. And some of you may not be aware that although I am married to a man, I'm bisexual, and that I grew up with, you know, I was a Holocaust survivor, child of a Holocaust survivor, but one parent was Jewish and one wasn't, and I was never Jewish enough for those folks. And then on the same end, I was never either straight enough or gay enough for either the straight community or the lesbian community, and I never fit in anywhere as a 12-year-old child. And you know, so there, and then I'm just curious as to whether what I saw coming up in life has changed in life for people who have stayed super active in the gay community, because I could have gone either way and I ended up with William, but I ended up with who I ended up with. And but basically when I was dealing with things younger on, when I was in the Bay Area, trans women were not accepted by lesbians. And bi women were looked down at by lesbians. First it was the gay task force, then it became the gay and lesbian task force. It was a long time before the B got in there or the T or any of this. And there's stuff inter-community that was problematic as well.
Yeah, I mean, Sandra, you put your finger on an ongoing challenge within the LGBTQ community. And again, this is something I'm reading about from outside. It's not part of my personal identity, but it has gotten better for sure. And there are still ongoing issues. There are trans rejecting people who are, you know, cisgendered, but lesbians or gays, and that's still the case. And again, as you pointed out, bisexual sometimes are rejected on both directions. So that does still happen for sure. I think it's better now than it was. It still has plenty of room to get better still.
Right. And then what happens when people hit the workforce? Like, for instance, I'm a very male-looking woman in a male field. And if I came out as bisexual, I wouldn't have a job in certain places I work. Now I work for myself, but it was clear there's still issues. And I'm wondering what will happen to this new generation with all its new verbs. And I'm also wondering what happened to Z and Zer, which was something that was used for trans in the past. And then now it's the different set of pronouns. It's getting confusing to me.
Life is going to just get more complicated. Some people like these sort of newly invented neologism pronouns, and some people, when they have a comfortable gender identity as not their birth identity, but who they really feel they've been, they want that affirmed, and not to create something new, but to be a he or she, because that's what they've often felt that they were. Julia, you've been waiting patiently. Thank you.
One of my favorite responses I've ever heard to someone who newly came out as non-binary asking what they should be referred to as, they replied that they didn't want people to refer to them. Which
just don't talk about
was just one. Right. But back on the kind of vein of sports teams and things, a lot of the perceived difference in the physical ability of people who you might worry in theory that somebody who has been raised as a little boy might be stronger or faster than someone who is raised as a little girl. But one of the things besides even just hormones is because you tell people when you think that they're a little boy to go run around and play outside, and if you think that someone's a little girl, you tell her to go sit inside and play with her dolls. And if we removed that kind of thing, then if people were allowed to do whatever they want regardless of what you thought they were, there would be a much smaller gap between the skill levels or between the average athletic abilities of people with different genders, regardless of what hormones they may or may not have been taking.
You know, I'll mention one last thing, and that is that it'd be very odd that somebody would go through all of the challenges of transitioning from male to female just for a scholarship. I mean, do you understand what this is doing? They're way more likely for suicide, for murder, for homelessness, for job discrimination, for all these terrible things. Do you really think they're doing that just to steal a scholarship spot on the track team? No, this is part of who they are as a person. And so, you know, the assumption that this is just done for scholarship purposes, is that it's all an act, that they're really a man. That's not really understanding the real dynamic of being transgender. So, and this will transform Jewish life too. You know, this has come up with the Chevra Kadisha, the Memorial Society in Jewish life, because if you have someone who is trans, which gender attendant is going to clean the body and be a shomer and watch the body while they're there? Not just the questions of liturgy, but questions of how to affirm their identity, but also to affirm the tradition of the institution. You know, in some ways, rabbis and liturgy is the easy stuff. It's the imagery, it's the concepts, it's the culture that still requires changing. So as sexual orientation was the challenge of the 90s to the 2010s or early, you know, 20-teens, I think gender will be the areas of major change in the next 15 to 20 years in Jewish life, and probably also in the broader society.